Our chapter on feminist ethics is by Hilde Lindemann, a philosopher at Michigan State University. Lindemann begins her essay by reviewing 4 different definitions of feminism. The first view, which is of historic vintage and is widespread in popular culture, focuses on equality. Feminism aims to make women the social equals of men. So, for example, feminists have campaigned at various times for equal education opportunities, equal property rights, voting rights, employment opportunities and pay, and equality in the domestic sphere, and so forth. But critics like bell hooks object that equality feminism ignores the different social positions that men and women occupy. Do women want to be equal to rich men or poor men, white, black, or brown men? Those who have the luxury of ignoring these questions usually occupy positions of privilege that themselves call for critical examination. Furthermore, as long as the goal is equality with men, men remain the ultimate reference point. So some feminists have tried to shift the focus away from men by arguing that feminism is about women, creating and developing women's values about themselves. But critics object that the very category of woman itself is a social construction. As Simone de Beauvoir wrote in 1949, one is not born but becomes a woman. What she means is that there is a difference between biological sex and socially constructed gender identity. Furthermore, the gender identity of woman often gets socially constructed in purely negative terms as not man. The woman-centered definition of feminism overlooks these complications. Another group takes a more positive view of the differences between men and women. On their view, feminism is about the positive affirmation of distinctly feminine qualities as a source of personal strength and pride. For example, some feminists have focused their ethics on caring relationships, or celebrated the emotional as opposed to rational nature of women. But according to critics, this approach overlooks the fact that certain differences between men and women are socially constructed precisely because they give men power over women. Lindemann's own approach stems from this criticism. On her view, feminism is about power, or in other words, gender. Feminism is about the social pattern widespread across cultures and history that distributes power asymmetrically to favor men over women, and that's exactly what she means by gender. Before I discuss Lindemann's theory of gender, let me give a little bit of historical background. Most, if not all, feminist or proto-feminist thinkers prior to Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex, in 1949, were more or less equality feminists. Even though they advocated for better education and civil rights for women, they assumed a clear and natural distinction between men and women, and often embraced conventional social roles for the sexes. We've already noted that Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex book drew attention to the social construction of manhood and womanhood. This idea became encoded in our language of gender in the late 1960s. In order to explain why some people felt that they were trapped in the wrong bodies, for example, a woman trapped inside a man's body, the psychologist Robert Stoller in 1968 began using the term sex to pick out biological traits and gender to pick out the amount of femininity and masculinity that a person exhibited. So with that historical backdrop, let's return to Lindemann's account of gender. According to Lindemann, gender is a norm, that is, a prescription for how people are supposed to act. And gender is an effective norm which creates the differences between men and women in these areas. It's a power relation which operates through social institutions and practices. And crucially, gender purports to be based on the natural biological distinction between the sexes. It's that complicated set of cultural meanings that are constructed around the two sexes. And it is commonly assumed that gender corresponds socially to biological sex. So if you're a male, you should act like a man, and if you are a female, you should act like a woman. But Lindemann objects that there is no natural basis for gender differences. She notes that even biological sex distinctions aren't always completely clear. Some people with XY chromosomes don't have receptors that respond to testosterone. Some are born with ambiguous genitalia, or with XO chromosomes instead of XX, or with 3 sets of chromosomes. Lindemann draws the conclusion that the unequal power relations constituted by gender differences are not natural, and therefore not legitimate. The task of feminist ethics, she says, is to try to understand, criticize, and correct how gender operates within our moral beliefs and practices. Specifically, feminist ethicists challenge asymmetrical power of men over women. They theorize about legitimate relations of unequal power, for example, the unequal power of parents over their children. And they look at various forms of power that are required for morality to operate properly at all. Now, while ethics traditionally focuses on normative, prescriptive questions, what ought we to do, feminist ethicists are invested in both prescription and description. They want to describe concealed power relations in society in order to critique them. On the prescriptive front, whatever their other differences, feminist ethicists are committed to at least 2 normative principles. First, the subordination of women is morally wrong, and second, women's experience must be taken seriously. Another distinctive feature of feminist ethics is that feminist ethicists don't separate morality from politics. We often assume that morality has to do with responsible, intentional choices by persons, whereas politics has to do with impersonal government systems. But feminists have insisted that the personal is political. That is, moral problems at the personal level are inextricable from their broader political context. Feminist ethicists lean into this interrelationship and try to make their ethics serve their political ends, and vice versa. Now that we've surveyed feminist ethics, here are 3 questions for you to consider. First, is it true that gender always oppresses women? Can you think of any gender norms, conventions, or rules that do not give men power over women? Second, is gender intrinsically oppressive? Could there be gender norms which assign distinct roles to men and women, but roles which are complementary and mutually beneficial rather than oppressive and exploitative? Is that conceivable? And third, could there be legitimate unequal power relations, and what are those? Lindemann notes that there are some legitimate relations of unequal power. For example, the relationship between parents and children. And maybe there are other examples of legitimate unequal power relations, such as that between employer and employee, officer and soldier, coach and player, presidents and citizens, teachers and students, and so forth and so on. What do you think makes an unequal power relation legitimate, and what makes it illegitimate? What gives one person a right to rule another person in some particular respect or degree?